Hi there. I hope that you folks are well. Before we go on, let's review where we've been so far. In the past 4 weeks, skipping over the week of midwinter, we have discussed ableism and intellectual disability at great length. We've determined that we need to root out and redeem ableism wherever we may find it. We've determined that ableism infects and affects all of our philosophical systems. We've called people with intellectual disabilities our neighbors, and quite recently we've used Vanier, Reynolds, and Calvin in different ways to show why that's so. Plus, last week we examined euthanasia, or mercy killing, from different theological and secular angles, along with other cognate concepts. And now, the fun part, for me anyway. Today, and to some degree in the next class, we will talk about how Jesus Christ, as the disabled God, impacts an ecclesiology of disability. Every part of this course has been impacted by my research, but this session particularly concerns a subspecies of that research. Today, our main lesson objective, really our only big goal, is to reinterpret Jesus Christ as we know him, as some of us know him in Scripture, in terms of an ecclesiology of disability. That is, today we will assert, as you can see on the slide, that Jesus of Nazareth empowers people with disabilities to form a vital and loving part of an inclusive church. That will be our thesis for the day. So you'll make 3 smaller moves in order to make that thesis clear. First, after we spend like 10 minutes or so recalling and evaluating Jesus' demographics, you'll analyze Luke 8:26 through 39 as a passage representative of Jesus' healing power and identity as liberator. Second, you'll examine Nancy Eiesland's portrait of Jesus as the disabled God at some length. Sam, I may have to apologize to you because you've been through parts of that already. And third, we will integrate Tom Reynolds' concept of Jesus as the icon of a vulnerable God with Eiesland's discourse to some degree. We'll put them side by side. So when you're ready, a lot of this discourse will include symbol, an object that points directly to another object. I say that because even though he was a person first, more significantly, the only capital P person who can offer human beings the embodied access that they need to flourish, Jesus is a symbol. As Bart will make very clear at a later point, Jesus is a subject who points to God, the ultimate subject of the universe. In a similar way, the waters of baptism and the bread and wine of Holy Communion are symbols too. Those material elements point to God's love through Jesus and to the vulnerability and availability that that love makes possible for human beings. Now, because they consist of bread, wine, and water, material elements, the sacraments also relate strongly to justice. We will return to that idea in the next week or next module. Let's start in with Jesus. In this case, I would like you to write out the answer to the following question for me, which you can see on the slide. Who is Jesus, and what does he do? Again, who is Jesus, and what does he do? I'm going to pause the video. I'd like you to write that out and write out an answer for yourself. Use that as the basis for your thought for the rest of this lecture. I look forward to hearing your answers. Let's fill them out a little bit. Let's start with Jesus' demographics. Jesus, called the Christ, the Greek transliteration of the Hebrew Messiah, which means anointed one, is the son of Mary, a Palestinian peasant girl. Jesus' foster father is Joseph, a carpenter from the town of Bethlehem in the territory of Judah. So Jesus, also called Joshua sometimes, fulfills the prophecies of Isaiah and the other Hebrew prophets about God's salvific action for people who are poor and oppressed. Jesus is both a brown-skinned manual laborer from Nazareth and the risen one who offers God's welcome, dignity, and joy to all. Jesus lives, dies, and rises again as a poor person in solidarity with other people who are poor. Indeed, Many passages of the Gospels, like the one we're about to read, make clear that Jesus includes the outsider and widens the scope of God's covenant with Israel to include everybody, significantly, and I'll come back to this later. In his mission and identity as the Son of God, Jesus offers healing to everyone. That includes people on the absolute margins of his society, like people with mental illnesses, as we're about to see. Jesus empowers people with disabilities to form a vital and loving part of his body, the church. So in light of our identification of Jesus through these demographic statements, let's clarify exactly who Jesus is with our first big lesson goal, analyzing portions of Luke 8:26 through 39 in terms of Jesus' healing power. Let me read you the whole passage. Then they arrived at the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite to Galilee. As he stepped out onto the land, a man of the city who had demons met him. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he did not live in a house but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he fell down before him and shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many times it had seized him. He was kept under guard, and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the wilds. Jesus then asked him, "What is your name?" He said, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. The demons begged him not to order them to go back into the abyss. Now, there on the hillside, a large herd of swine was feeding, and the demons begged Jesus to let them enter these, so he gave them his permission. And then the demons came out of the man and entered the pigs, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. When the swineherds saw what had happened, they ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came out to see what had happened, and when they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone, sitting at Jesus' feet, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. Those who had seen it told them how the one who had been possessed by demons had been healed, and then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them, for they were seized with great fear. So he got into the boat, and he returned. The man from whom the demons had gone out begged that he might go with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your home, declare how much God has done for you." So the man went away, proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him. Now, think within yourselves just for a moment. How does that passage strike you, folks? When you hear it, what do you hear? What jumps out at you? For now, observe carefully, both that, as usually happens in the Gospels, the demon knows Jesus' identity, and that it keeps the guy away from the able-bodied folk of the city. So the demon knows exactly who Jesus is, and the demon is also carefully binding the man that it occupies. This fella, the one who lives in the tombs in Gerasa, has to be bound at all times, and because he hangs out near graves and in crypts, he is completely ritually unclean. Here, Kathy Black, former teacher of deaf undergraduates who teaches homiletics, that is the science of preaching, at Claremont, chimes in helpfully. She asserts, in her book Healing Homiletic, that rather than having a demon, the man probably has some sort of mental illness. That part about mental illness is significant, because it conditions Jesus' response. Think about Jesus' reply carefully. Jesus asks the demon, "What is your name?" The demon's name is Legion. Discovering the demon's name is a way for Jesus to reach the person behind the mental illness. He places himself at risk in terms of ritual impurity, but he also offers the man what Black calls a healing touch, as well as respect and a sense of belonging. I have to agree with Jesus' approach here, because he ultimately gets to know the person first. By attempting to reach the person, Jesus forms a connection that empowers the guy in the tombs in Gerasa, a single person with a disability, to form a vital and loving part of an inclusive church, of Jesus' body. Plus, as we've heard, that connection also allows the man to form other relationships. Significantly, this is also my experience. I learned a great deal about treating people with mental illnesses as people because I worshipped with them for 5 to 7 years in Toronto in different contexts. For instance, the guy with schizophrenia who would sometimes paint and sew quietly in the back of the pews and at other times be loud and belligerent during worship was not just a guy with schizophrenia. His name is James. He's one of the most dedicated artists that I know. So in this passage, Jesus affirms people like James. He affirms that people with mental illnesses are people first, even before we might step in to address their conditions. Another useful interpretation of Luke 8:26 through 39 comes from Ched Myers. Now, Myers is a biblical scholar and a political theologian, active in several grassroots movements for equity here in the States. Myers asserts that the demon is named Legion because he represents the Gerasene people's anger and fear concerning the occupying Roman force, the Roman army. And Myers goes on to say that when Jesus heals the guy who lives in the tombs, he's actually helping the townspeople in Gerasa to express their fear and their anger, or to confront it. And that makes sense of the townspeople's response to Jesus. Of course they want Jesus to leave Gerasa because the healing of the guy with the demon named Legion forces them to confront their anger at the Roman occupation. And that confrontation makes them really uncomfortable. So as we can see, Jesus' healing powers are hella complicated. I would welcome any comments or questions you have about that passage. Jesus offers people of all abilities divine equality and justice, the mutual and shared power that forms a part of God's reign through his healing power. As for me, I would define healing as growth through trauma and pain towards well-being and joy. And one of the best parts about Jesus is that Jesus offers that kind of healing to everyone. He offers it directly to the single leper in Mark chapter 1. He offers it from a distance to the daughter of the Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman, and up close to the woman with the flow of blood. And he offers a changed perception to the man born blind in John chapter 9 that allows that man to both know and celebrate Jesus' identity. And most significantly, Jesus goes to the cross, not only to demonstrate the destruction of sin and death, but also to show the way of God's healing, peace, and justice to all humankind. Jesus' gift on the cross, his vulnerability, empowers people with disabilities to form a vital and loving part of an inclusive church, Jesus' body. Jesus carries our diseases, says the prophet Isaiah. Bonhoeffer, whom you can see here, corroborates, stating in his letters and papers from prison that only the suffering God can help. I feel like that quotation is pretty straightforward. Bonhoeffer means that Jesus has compassion on humankind and lives in solidarity through human beings wherever there are people who suffer. Which leads us somewhat indirectly to our second goal. Nancy Eiesland's portrait of Jesus as the disabled God. First, some context on Eiesland. Nancy L. Eiesland was born in April of 1964, and she did her graduate work at the Candler School of Theology, the Theological College at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Eiesland had a congenital bone defect, according to her obituary. That disability necessitated numerous surgeries on her hips, particularly in her youth, and described the contours of physical pain throughout her life. Eiesland died of a possibly genetic lung cancer in March of 2009 at the age of 44. The Disabled God is a revision of Eiesland's graduate thesis that she published around the age of 30 in 1994. It's her lengthiest and most significant surviving work. Eiesland's analyses had a very profound effect on the study of disability in theological and religious circles, precisely because her concept of Jesus as the disabled God is so striking. Her work reinforces my thesis about Jesus' empowerment of people with disabilities. Let's think through part of what she says together. So in her 5th chapter, which I hope you've read by now, Eiesland states very carefully and with some detail that Jesus Christ is the disabled God. One of the first things she says is that for her, God is a survivor on pitying and forthright. She also notes that Jesus is a symbol of God's revelation in human flesh. There's that word again. Jesus is an object that points to another object. She places Jesus in the context of disability because, as she says, the incarnation is the ultimate contextual revelation. Jesus isn't just an itinerant Palestinian preacher or a carpenter, but the God who comes to earth to live with us, to heal us, to eat and drink with us, to be wounded on the cross for us, and to rise again with wounded limbs for our sakes, so that we can see that God loves and blesses our bodies just as they are. Jesus' entry into human life is very empowering for people with disabilities. Let me quote Eiesland fully. In Luke 24:36-39, Eiesland sees the resurrected Christ making good on the incarnational proclamation that God would be with us embodied as we are, incorporating the fullness of human contingency and ordinary life into God. By presenting his impaired hands and feet to his startled friends, the resurrected Jesus is revealed as the disabled God. The disabled God is not only the one from heaven, but the revelation of true personhood, underscoring the reality that full personhood is fully compatible with the experience of disability. Do you guys recognize how amazing a claim that is? Let me be perfectly clear. In the passage I just read, Eiesland is saying the following things. She's saying that Jesus, the wounded, risen Jesus, makes it okay for people with disabilities to love our bodies as they are, because the resurrected Lord has incorporated disability into the life of the Judeo-Christian God. In the wounded Jesus, God himself is wounded, and in the resurrection, Jesus' wounds are still present, but they do not in any way prevent him from sharing God's love with his friends. I love that quotation because it motivates me to love my body. I owe to a theology of disability, and to some degree to Eiesland in particular, the strength that keeps me going to the gym every few days. Furthermore, Eiesland is making clear that the exclusionary praxes that still hold sway in the church are an aberration, an abnormal and ableist reaction not based in the embodied and experiential revelation of Jesus as a person. The risen Jesus is a wounded person still capable of self-giving, and a healed person who still displays the vulnerability that healing entails. We'll return to Dr. Eiesland briefly next week when we discuss the sacraments, and if you have any questions, I will happily address them when I return from Louisville. Let's examine Reynolds in terms of Jesus, our third and final lecture goal for the day. After he discusses creation, sin as part of creation's tragic structure, and God's presence in the midst of human suffering, all in chapter 5 of Vulnerable Communion, Reynolds examines the Imago Dei, the image of God, anew in chapter 6. He asserts that the image of God in humankind has three parts. First, the image of God is creative. God calls humankind in Genesis to be fruitful and multiply, and gives us a kind of co-creative mandate with God. Moreover, humankind reflects God's image in our relationships, in our ability to name creatures and to relate to each other as friends, as co-creators, as male and female, and in other ways. Lastly, God's image in humanity is available. Human beings are free to love others and are able to present ourselves to each other in ways that reveal our yearning for connection and consent. So for Reynolds, the image of God represents God's creative, relational, and available love. That said, he also acknowledges that in the serpent and in Genesis 3, that image is tarnished by sin. Sin, in my tradition, is a potential for personal choices, and systemic choices too, that turn away from humanity's relationship to God, to human beings, and the earth. Sin is also a force that pervades our choices and our social systems. So, sin distorts the creative, relational, available matrix of the Imago Dei, so that humankind, God's children, formed of dust, can no longer have uninterrupted access to God or to the abundance of God's creation. We're stuck in a pattern of what Reynolds calls cupiditas, idolatry, concupiscence. We look for value and meaning in all the wrong places. Now, Jesus comes back in. Jesus re-enters the picture. Once sin enters the picture and empowers people of all abilities with his re-entry. So Reynolds calls Jesus the icon of a vulnerable God, partly because Jesus addresses and redresses the effects of sin. Jesus is open to humanity in the same way that God is, so his powers to heal and save can effect redemption for humankind. Plus, Jesus invites the poor, the outcasts, and the immoral to what Reynolds calls the divine banquet, an inclusive table fellowship of divine regard. Because Jesus is open to people who are vulnerable, according to Reynolds, he is the fully human person, the one who represents the restoration of God's image for all humanity. And Dr. Reynolds asserts that on the cross, Jesus offers God's vulnerability, availability, and forgiveness to humankind. Through Jesus, the disabled God, the Godhead offers God's eternal life to people ensnared in sin's disorientation and death by embracing material things and welcoming people in their bodies. Jesus empowers people with disabilities to love our bodies. And Reynolds' point connects here to Eiesland because in his woundedness, Jesus shares with his friends the creative and healing love of God and empowers others to share themselves in the same ways. That is a good point at which to step back and recap. In this class, and in the one that follows it, our thesis is Jesus of Nazareth empowers people with disabilities to form a vital and loving part of an inclusive church. Today, in order to make that thesis clear, you did three short, significant things. First, after we recalled Jesus' demographic data to some degree, you analyzed Luke 8:26 through 39 in order to explore Jesus' healing power. Second, you examined Nancy Eiesland's portrait of Jesus as the disabled God at some length with my guidance. And third, you integrated Tom Reynolds' concept of Jesus as the icon of a vulnerable God with Eiesland's discourse in one place and explored it in itself as well. All of that should have helped us to demonstrate Jesus' empowerment of believers with disabilities. I look forward to thinking through this material with you on my return from Louisville. If you have no questions, go in peace. Thank you.